Welcome to Conscious Living, Co-op Radio 100.5 FM in Vancouver. I'm Tasha Simms, and today we're speaking with filmmaker Suzanne Crocker. Her film, First We Eat, is streaming at the Vancouver International Film Festival. Every day from now until October 9th, the festival's on. So many brilliant films you can catch, documentaries, features. Go to www.viff.org. So filmmaker Suzanne Crocker put food scarcity to the test. Her film, unbelievable. You've got to see it. They were, I think, 300 kilometers from the Arctic Circle. She had moved to the Yukon with her family. We'll hear a little bit about that, but she'd made a movie about the move called All the Time in the World. This film, First We Eat, Suzanne, she keeps going. Suzanne and her 3 skeptical teens and reluctant husband agree to ban all grocery store food from the house, no salt, no caffeine, no sugar for 365 days. And that includes getting through a 40 below winter. Yeah. So again, that film, First We Eat, at VIFF, and it's on until October 7th. Just go online. You can get a pass or buy tickets and stream the movie. Suzanne's commitment to eat nothing but local food sourced from the community itself in the Yukon for a whole year is such an incredible study of sustainability. And it's funny. I mean, it's challenging. It's delightful. It won a Rogers Audience Choice Award and a top 20 audience pick out of 140 films from around the world. Welcome to the show, Suzanne.
Thank you so much. Thank you for that wonderful intro.
Well, I think you're so brave. I really do. Like, there you are. Not only did you make this move, leaving behind creature comforts a while back, but you've learned in this film, you're learning to cook in an entirely new way, how to survive off the land, hunting, gathering, sharing with locals. And if that's not enough, you're filming it, which is in itself, being an actor, I know what that involves. Honestly, superhuman effort. So congrats. And I feel like viewers who watch your film feel like they spend a year with you and the family. And it's funny and it's emotional as they kind of drift between being resourceful and resentful. So I wonder if we could start with just a little backstory. Your first film, All the Time in the World, had you moving the family to the Yukon. Can you share how come you did that and where you moved from and how come you stayed?
Well, I'll just correct a little bit. So we were already living in the Yukon in Dawson City, and before we did the film All the Time in the World. But what we did in All the Time in the World is, let me backtrack. If you live in Vancouver and you have to get away from it all, I don't know, you go to the Gulf Islands, I guess. Yeah. And if you live there and you have to get away from it all, you go to Dawson City. But where do you go if you live in Dawson City and you have to get away from it all? Well, you go to the bush. And so that's what we did. We hauled our 3 kids who were 8, 10, and 4, or 10, 8, and 4 at the time. And we took a sabbatical from work and we went and lived in the Yukon wilderness for 9 months over the winter, in a small cabin with no electricity, no running water, no internet, no cell phone service, and not a single clock or watch. And that is the subject of All the Time in the World. Right. But we did haul in our own food. So this, First We Eat came 7 years later. And
so you're living that way for 7 years?
No, we really just were there for a year. And then we went back to Dawson City, which city is a bit of a misnomer. There's only 1,500 people there. It's a tiny town literally at the end of the road, 300 kilometers south of the Arctic Circle. And so then the other half of that was, okay, well, I know we can live here, without the grid, but what about food? Could we sustain ourselves in this era only on local food that can be produced here, grown here, harvested off the land? And hence we come to First We Eat.
Right. And I understand 97% of food there in the Yukon's being trucked in. Yes?
Yeah, that's right. And what was inspiring to me when I was thinking of doing this project was, obviously thousands of years ago, Indigenous people ate 100% locally. And then when settlers came to Dawson, a little over 100 years ago, apparently there was a point in time when Dawson was producing 97% of its own food. So it's interesting to me that over the years, we gradually have moved away from that self-sufficiency until now it's the exact opposite, that we're trucking in 97%. And of course, because we're so far north, that food is coming from far, far, far away. So I definitely wanted to see if we could go back to 100% local and nothing that's trucked in.
So your family's
everything went from the house that came from a store.
And your family's initial reaction and what it took to convince them, because they weren't quite on board at the beginning, right?
No, they weren't on board at all. In fact, they flatly refused. So I feel that this was more conscription than anything at the beginning. My first hurdle was to get my husband on board, which was not an easy task, I have to say. But since my kids were not want to go to the grocery store and buy their own food and haul it home, I thought if I could get my husband on board, then we have a chance. So I did manage over months to gradually convince him of all the reasons why it would be a good idea and why he should be intrigued. And eventually I won him over, and that was the winning moment. And then really the kids were out of luck after that.
Right. I loved in the film when you had your last cup of tea. I know tea was a big deal to you. Maybe for someone else, it would be their cup of coffee that they knew they were giving up. The expression on your face was priceless. So I want to know what was actually going through your head as you had that last cup.
Yeah, well, I mean, I knew it was coming, a year without caffeine, because there's just no caffeine source that can be produced in the Yukon. But tea was, obviously I learned in the beginning part of that year how much a drug it was for me to get me through my day, and kind of a crutch to allow me to stay up way too late. But also it was my comfort drink, that was my sort of little moment of reprieve, to have my hot cup of tea. And so at that moment of having my last sip, I just became so emotional about losing that. I surprised myself, really. But I guess it was just kind of a good metaphor for maybe all the comfort foods and my comfort zone that I was about to leave behind for a year and delve into this world of the unknown, not really being a cook, not knowing how much food I would need, all these unknowns.
And what you're illuminating is how much we do rely on, like I think of quitting smoking when I listen to you, because it's the same thing. You're basically saying, you're not saying it's not about the cigarette, it's not about the cup of tea, it's the experience that you've been giving yourself that has such deep, deep value. And so, yes, saying goodbye to that and stopping it, I totally get how that would be emotional. What was it for the family? Did they have other things that they went, oh, I can't live without this?
Oh, so many. I think bagels was a big one. I think for the kids, it was that grab and go filler food. So, like a bagel and peanut butter, or in the morning for breakfast, being able to pull out the box of Cheerios and yeah. So just kind of like, I think that was the hardest part for them, was having all that snack food, that grab and go easy stuff gone, and not really at the beginning, not really knowing what they could turn to.
And,
for my husband, I definitely was those as well, plus coffee. He was a big coffee drinker.
So then we get to the work, because that's the part that I don't know how many urban people think about. I think there's a line in the film talking about bread, and maybe you can correct me. It's a long way to a loaf or something like that.
Yeah, that's right. A long way to a loaf of bread.
To a loaf of bread. Like the amount of work. You looked at 3 days in, they started to look a little more curious. You looked exhausted. So tell us about, maybe give us a Cole's notes of how this journey unfolded for you. Can you do that?
Sure. Well, I had thought that starting at a time of plenty would be a reasonable idea. But I didn't realize that that meant that at the same time as I was learning, I mean, I didn't really know how to cook, period. So I was learning how to cook. I was learning how to make things from scratch, you know, make my own butter. And I, at the same time, was having to harvest and process everything for the winter. So, and you only have this short period of time in which to get all the food you can, and not really knowing how much food your family is going to need. So that was a bit of pressure. So this was all happening at the same time. And so it was very much overwhelming at first. Yeah, just unbelievably overwhelming. But after a while, you know, you get in a groove, you learn some of those skills, you get into a routine, and it definitely becomes way, way easier. But I just, you know, jumped in with both feet into the deep end. And yeah, I was floundering for a while.
And it's never ending, right? Like there's no, it's, I guess, how people used to live. Like it was, your living was working to live.
Yes.
Right?
Yes. But then, you know, once you have all your food for the year, then, you know, it's kind of wonderful because everything is under your roof.
Right.
And then you have time. Then you have time to get creative and time, you know, time to cook.
Well, let's talk about still stocking everything up before we hit that place where you can start to experiment with some of the odd things you did. I thought of this after and went, why did I not know that you could have birch syrup the same way you have maple? Like, I know maybe some people know that. I didn't know that. I just never thought about it. Right. But you had lots of birch trees, not so many maple. So you made birch syrup, for instance, right?
Yeah, that's right. We don't, maple trees just don't grow that far north. So
Right.
it's not an option. But yeah, you can tap a birch tree like you tap a maple tree.
Right.
Only the difference is that the ratio of sap to syrup is double what it is for maple syrup. So I think for maple syrup, you know, around 50 liters makes a liter of maple syrup, and it's 80 to 100 of birch sap to make a liter of syrup. And the other thing about birch syrup, unlike maple syrup, is it won't crystallize. So there's no way to get sugar out of it.
So you had some sweets, which I'm sure the kids loved. Your search for salt was hilarious, just hilarious, from going through mud to using blood, a friend's blood. You've got to share that with the listeners.
Well, yes, we're landlocked in Dawson City, so there's no option of getting sea salt. So yeah, it just became a curiosity as to where we would find a salt or a salt substitute. And I tried some plant sources like coltsfoot ash. Coltsfoot grows wild. And it's fascinating because coltsfoot on its own tastes like nothing. And when you burn it, the ash actually tastes salty, which is super cool. And dried celery leaves, celery juice, these were all kind of salt alternatives. But it just became this ongoing, I don't know, goal to see how we could get salt. Could we get salt from mineral licks, for example? And then a doctor friend of mine said, well, you know, there's salt in our blood. That's the sodium and chloride that we get blood tests for. So why couldn't we get salt from blood? And of course, the idea was not to get salt from human blood, but the idea was to get salt from animal blood, since you're harvesting the animal anyway,
Right.
and using all parts of the animal and not letting the blood just go to waste dripping on the ground. But to centrifuge, like to get salt out of blood, you have to centrifuge to remove the red blood cells. So to centrifuge large quantities of animal blood, that was a whole other conundrum. How could we do that? So yeah, we went through various iterations of options and came up with using a washing machine, this upright washing machine, to try and use that as a centrifuge for large quantities of blood. Only we had this idea and wanted to see if we could make it work, but it wasn't the time to harvest animals. So there was no blood available. So then the doctor came up with this great idea that we would just take a bit of his blood and try it out and see if it was going to work.
What a good pal.
Yeah, What an inquisitive mind, really. And but yeah, not to worry. There's no worry about blood donor clinics for salt up in the Yukon.
I love the kids though. I think one of the kids said, "This is going to scar me for life," or something like that. It was
Yes.
funny. And what do you think? I mean, that sounds like maybe the weirdest, but did you top that at any point? Was there something even weirder that y'all tasted or tried?
Oh, yeah. Well, I mean, there were lots of things that we hadn't had before. Burbot liver, salmon
Burbot?
burbot, so a fish that you ice fish for.
Ah,
Yeah, so the liver of the burbot is really full of vitamin D. So cooking up that, salmon eggs, lots of foraged foods we'd never tried before, bear meat. I don't know if I want to give the whole film away, but yeah, there were lots of interesting things. And what I found interesting with my kids is at the beginning, like all that different food, there was kind of, they were willing to try it, but there was a bit of a hesitancy and a yuck factor. And as the year went on, um, you know, when there was something, I had this habit of presenting them with something and then later
yeah.
asking them to guess what it was. And as it went, as the year went on, then they would kind of very casually start guessing all kinds of creatures as if absolutely anything was okay at this point, that they'd been through almost anything before.
And
Yeah.
what was that like for you? I mean, you were a vegetarian, right? For a long time. This is a bit, had
Yeah,
you already moved to meat at this point?
I had when I married a moose hunter. That was the turning point for me,
Uh-huh.
especially since he liked to cook and I didn't. And wild meat is a staple up north, and
Right.
yeah, a moose will feed two families for a year, and it prevents us from having to buy industrial meat shipped up from down south. So I did move from being a vegetarian at that point, but he was kind of the meat cook, and I let him deal with that, and I would make the vegetarian meals for the family.
Right.
So this was different for me, going to a diet that was all animal based as far as protein went, because there just is no protein that we can produce in the north that's not animal based.
Mm-hmm.
So I had to learn to become very comfortable with not only meat, but using all parts of the animal, so organ meat as well, and blood and bones and hearts and livers and
Mm-hmm.
kidneys and everything.
We're so removed, right? You go to the grocery store, it's packaged. People don't even think of animals. It's in a package. It's meat. And I know having, like, I tried this in my 20s out in Prince Edward Island, and the mistake I made was giving the animals names, the animals that were going to be butchered. Because I kept saying, if I'm going to eat meat, I should understand the process and I should experience it, not be removed from it. And I couldn't do it. I mean, the animals that had names didn't get butchered because they got names. Do you know what I mean? Like once, I wonder if you have any thoughts about that process and what one has to do. It's like a mindset that one would have to be in healthy relationship with, let's say, meat if you're going to eat it. Do you have thoughts on that?
Yeah, for sure. And a couple of the farmers, have voiced that as well. One does so in the film. One did so, but it's not in the film, where he talked about the animals that he cares for on his farm and how he treats them as pets until it's time for them to become food. And another farmer talked about just having to make that disconnect, between pets and food. And for me, I thought I was going to have difficulty with that because just as you said, you wanted to experience, I thought it was really important for me to be there for the whole process and to have met and known these animals when they were, growing up from piglets or from chicks to the point of harvest, and then actually being there at the harvest and being there when they're dispatched and then turned into food. And it wasn't as difficult as I thought it was going to be. And I feel it was because having been there through the whole process, I knew how well those animals were cared for and respected and treated as they were raised. And of course, I mean, I still, anytime that you see a life expire, I have an emotional feeling, but because I, I understood the process and I understood that this is what it takes to get it on my plate. It's still, there was a heartfelt moment for sure, but it wasn't as hard as I thought. And I think it is really important to understand that. There's one scene in the film where the chicken is harvested, and I think it's really interesting that during the process, I think there's often a lot of kind of yuck reaction, removing guts and removing feathers and things like that. And then the end of the process, that when the chicken goes into the bag and it looks like the chicken that we buy in the store, then it's all of a sudden, oh yeah, very familiar. But how interesting to realize that to get to that point, you actually have to go through those steps.
Right.
And I think that's important to know, to understand.
And I loved how you shared, although it was around salmon or Chinook, how the indigenous people were in relationship with what they were going to eat and said a prayer of gratitude. And like there was a direct connection. It wasn't taken for granted, I'm killing you. And, everything that they took, there was gratitude and prayer for. And I think even here that could be relevant. Yes.
Yes. I felt that with the farmers too. And I certainly felt that personally, like I said, thank you every time an animal was harvested for food. And similarly, when my husband was hunting for the moose, he definitely felt that that sense of gratitude, that sense of offering of a life so that we would have the meat.
At one point in the film, you said as a mother, you were questioning whether this was actually helpful for your kids or torturing them. So where did you land in that answer?
Yeah, I guess, that's probably still a matter of debate who you're asking, me or the kids. But yeah, I do feel very strongly, obviously, that it's important to understand where our food comes from, important to understand the process of that food so that not only can we have a relationship with it, but that we are, to the best of our ability, able to choose food that has been grown or harvested sustainably and has been properly treated and cared for and isn't full of pesticides and growth hormones and things like that. So I just feel that it's incredibly important. And I think, certainly by the end of it, my kids had an appreciation for that. This past year, interestingly, with the pandemic and their usual summer job opportunities disappearing, my two older kids both ended up working for farmers, doing some volunteer work and then getting jobs for farmers. And Sam also was foraging wild mushrooms this summer. And so those were experiences that they certainly never would have contemplated before. Right. So it kind of brought it a bit full circle for me that they were able to do that. So I think deep down there definitely has been an appreciation for where their food comes from learned along the way. So
I love that.
Yeah.
There was a point about halfway through, I guess around New Year's, where, well, maybe take us into the winter. So you've stocked up all these things, right? And tell us what you've got and who you got it from a little bit, just so people can get excited about what happens next. That place of feeding.
Our meat supply was moose that Gerard had harvested, and some pork and chicken, as well as some chum salmon. And then we had vegetables stored in a root cellar for our vegetables. Our fruit was berries. we're fortunate to have had some dairy cows move into our community just a few years before I started this project. I originally thought it was going to be a dairy-free year, so I was so thrilled when I found out we had dairy cows on the far side of a river that nobody knew about. And so, yeah, I had, the option of milk and eggs and making my own cheese, ice cream, yogurt, those kinds of things. And then, of course, I had things pressure canned. I mean, there was no vinegar, so you couldn't can things that way. And there was
Pickles.
salt. Yeah. So I did actually make some pickles using rhubarb juice as the vinegar, but I kept them in the fridge because, I couldn't be absolutely sure that I wouldn't kill my family with botulism. Otherwise, it would not have been a good ending to the project. So yeah, we had all that food, and which was great. But storing, like the storage aspect is huge, and you really realize that, well, I realized the reason for stores is for storing things, and how that's one of the choke points. Like not everybody, can have 4 freezers and 12 tubs on their veranda all winter full of food and food hanging from their banisters. Like that's just not reasonable.
Right.
So we need a way to be able to use our storage for locally produced food that then can be accessible to the community. I remember talking to a woman recently, an older woman, who remembered when everybody had a root cellar in their house and there would be communal meat lockers and everybody would have their own meat locker for their meat for the winter. So, there's certainly ways around it, but storage is huge.
Well, and sharing or bartering. Like I remember when I was the one making the butter, yogurt, and cheese. I had a herd of goats. Like I knew nothing. I was city girl, sort of similar, except you probably knew tons more than I did. I had no idea. No electricity, no mirrors, same thing. And we would just trade. So I'd find someone who had honey and I would give them cheese. They would give me honey, or my partner would work on the land chopping wood or whatever. Like you trade off skills. Do you think there's room for that kind of living, even if you were in an urban environment, that there's something we can do to, I guess the whole purpose is reconnect with our relationship directly with the food that we eat?
Yeah, for sure. And there's so many examples of ways to produce food, even within urban environments, even in cities as big as New York City, with converting rooftops and empty lots to gardens, and people who keep bees on their rooftops, and people who, in office buildings, instead of planting ornamental shrubs, will plant something that's edible that people can graze on as they walk by. I mean, the list goes on and on and on. So yeah, for sure. It's certainly doable. And of course, where in southern Canada, there's so many more growing opportunities for food than way up north. So, the ability to connect with farmers who are just on the outskirts of the city, who are producing amazing food, is also so valuable in cities. But for sure, there's still room for that, for food sharing, for cooperative. I think, again, like some of the choke points have to do with storage and then convenience, like people still like the convenience of going to one store and getting all their groceries. But if that one store also was stocking locally produced food, then how great would that be?
Right. Yeah.
So,
what was your hardest point in this year-long adventure?
There were many challenges. I think certainly trying to win over my family was a struggle. Worrying about if we would have enough was a struggle. Trying to make 100% sourdough rye bread.
Did you ever succeed, by the way?
I did succeed, but never on a consistent basis. I had a few amazing loaves, and I had many failures. But what was interesting to me is I learned to really appreciate that bread. It was so full of flavor. And afterwards, when I would try and eat a bread product, that I would have enjoyed before, I found it incredibly bland. So I've never really gotten a taste for regular bread again.
Wow. I think it was around New Year's, you said failure in the film. Failure is, you realized it wasn't inevitable. Something happened there where something happened that fed your optimism and your hope. And I'm wondering if you can recall what that was. Was it
Well,
because you were at a halfway mark, or?
I'm a very determined person. So,
No
um,
kidding.
yeah, I don't like to fail. And so that was certainly a driving factor. There is something that's not in the film that was a huge help, that there's a woman, Michelet, who's an incredible chef and has written several cookbooks using foods from the boreal forest, called the Boreal Feast, the Boreal Gourmet. She lives in Whitehorse, which is 550 kilometers from Dawson. And I contacted her about this project that I was doing, and she was so excited that she actually came to Dawson and moved into my house for a week. And
Wow.
she was so thrilled to just have this limited supply of ingredients, and how could we do things? And so that, I feel, was a real turning point, both for me, because she kind of took my creativity in the kitchen and brought it to a new level, and just from her skill, but also from her enthusiasm. And I also feel it was a turning point for my family, because then here was this woman who was so enthusiastic about what was going on, and could help me make delicious things, that they got a little tiny bit more on board at that point.
Right.
So she was kind of a secret weapon that unfortunately didn't make it into the film, but was definitely huge for my year. And I also realized about myself that I do better with limitations. Like, if you give me an endless variety of choice, I just become paralyzed by the choice. And when you limit my options, then that's when my creativity really starts to flourish. So I found, I loved never having to go shopping. I'm not a shopper to begin with, so I loved that. But I found just having these sets of ingredients in my house, that just really got my creative juices flowing. And so that also helped, I think, get me through the year, especially because at that point I had time to do that. I already had gathered what I needed. So then there was time to be creative.
Right.
And sometimes it failed, but occasionally it was successful. And that was a brilliant motivator to keep going.
It's such an interesting observation, because you say that that's how you work. I wonder if it's not relevant to everyone. And it immediately made me think about how distracted we all can be, whether it's the phone or there's so many choices of what to do with your time, and easy because it's right in front of you. You're talking about in a state where things are limited, that perhaps more creativity can flow through you, that you can receive it. And I wonder, when I think about the whole youth generation currently, how that might be relevant to what everyone's going through. This is why I think the pandemic is of interest, for me, especially in terms of you just can't do what you used to do to ignore it. You can't just ignore it. Right. And so that's what you're talking about. It's some kind of a wake-up call. And in your case, limitation. So now creativity can come through. But I just wonder if you have any thoughts about that in the current generation and our technology and everything else.
Yeah, I definitely do. And it was a theme for the last film, All the Time in the World, as well, that with the kids, taking them away from all these things meant to entertain them, be it physical things or extracurricular activities, and putting them in this remote cabin in the wilderness with no friends and no technology. that their imagination and their creativity flourished, and the things they created and the games. And I mean, it was just astounding, and how like how enriching that was, not just for them, but for the whole family. And so, yeah, I feel there's a positive side to boredom, allowing us to be bored. There's a positive side to not being so distracted and so stimulated all the time. And it's so satisfying when those creative juices start to go again. I'm going to have a sip. It's not orange pekoe tea. It's chamomile. And because I'm away from home, it came from a store. But when I'm home, I still drink chamomile, like that I've harvested from a pineapple weed, which is a wild chamomile.
Oh, and what about chicory? Can't you grow chicory?
No.
Oh.
Yeah. No.
So we're sort of getting to the end of the film where you realized, okay, this is our last local supper, and they all thought they were eating chicken. So I definitely want to ask you what it was, because I don't think you said in the film what it actually was. Did you? No, and I missed it.
You really want me to give all the secrets away?
Okay, but yeah. I didn't see it in the film. That's why I'm asking. Are you sure it's in there? And I just missed it?
No, it's not in there. Yeah, no, that last one was rabbit, actually.
Rabbit. But what was interesting to me is how emotional I got. I went, what's going on? Like, I didn't expect it. So I'm having this journey with you guys, and here's the last meal, and all of a sudden, and you chose to stick with it. You didn't right away move to processed food, but all these feelings, like, I don't really understand why I got teary. What was it like for you to look at your family and know this was it? This was the last local meal. They're going to go back to processed food. And why did you choose not to?
Yeah, it was very emotional for me because, I finally, well, over the year, I had definitely transformed and come to a point where eating locally just seemed so much superior in so many ways. And I guess, it was just kind of an emotional moment, I guess, wondering, I suppose, from the eagerness that the grocery store food came back, if the rest of my family had taken anything away from the experience other than me torturing them for a year. I have the advantage of hindsight now, and of course understand why they were excited to try many of those flavors again, and understand completely that it doesn't mean that they didn't learn anything. But at the time, I guess that's what I was feeling. And yeah, and it just, so that's partly why it felt so emotional. But I didn't stop, and I still continue when I'm home. I do eat, I would say 90 to 95% local still. I still, I've just finished stocking our house with food again for the winter. My husband is out moose hunting again. I mean, I'm not as diehard because during that year, if I went away, I hauled tubs of Dawson food with me when I traveled, and I didn't travel very often, but now, of course, I don't go to that extreme. And a few things, have crept back into my diet, like oil and vinegar and granulated sugar and baking powder.
Right.
But yeah, for the most part, it's still, again, all our meat, fish, all our dairy, all our vegetables year round, all our berries, all our eggs are all local. So we are continuing on. And yeah, I'm very happy with that. It's a joy to eat seasonally.
Yeah.
And it's a joy to eat this locally produced and harvested food because it just tastes so good. And you do have that connection. Like, you do know where single thing on your plate has come from, and the people who helped put it there, and the land that helped put it there. And that's just an incredibly humbling experience.
It's intimate. Yeah. I know your husband said he lost 30 pounds. You went off your blood pressure medication. Any other impact physically, emotionally with the family or with you?
Yeah, I definitely felt incredibly healthy. I was very well rested, I think, and had good energy. I think part of that was not having the crutch of caffeine. So I learned to go to bed at a reasonable time when I was tired. Um, and yeah, health-wise, mentally, everything, I felt great, which is another reason to want to continue on it.
Mm-hmm.
And I think, as I mentioned, for the rest of the family, I mean, they continued to be healthy. My children did not lose weight, which they're not supposed to, so that was good. Um, but yeah, just having a whole new connection and understanding of where our food comes from, I hope anyway, will stick with my kids in some way back there for the
Yeah.
rest of their lives.
And I guess I also want to ask, I mean, you're a filmmaker, so you're going, I love these, like, it's like a social experiment, and then you film every single moment. How was that process combined with what you were actually going through? Because you're the subject and at the same time you're the filmmaker.
Yeah, it's difficult for sure. I mean, especially when you're filming yourself. I mean, there's pros and there's cons. I mean, the pros are that unlike if you have a camera crew, I'm always there. So with my family, there's no people from outside coming into our space with cameras and microphones and everybody
Mm-hmm.
feeling a little, you know, changed by that. So when I have the camera, I think my family just has learned to ignore it, and they just carry on being who they are. So that's a definite pro. And you can be there for moments when they just come up spontaneously and film them. It doesn't all, have to be planned for a shooting schedule. The hard part, I guess, is filming yourself, because it's very difficult to frame a shot because you can't be behind and in front of the camera at the same time,
Mm-hmm.
obviously.
Mm-hmm.
So the tripod got a credit in both, it's a credit in both my films for that reason. But also you become very aware of the background when you're framing a shot to figure out how you should be in space. And it doesn't always work out, but you have to forgive yourself for not having yourself framed perfectly when you're not behind the camera. And lots of times it does work out. But there is definitely a beauty in also being the camera person and just being able to capture intimate and authentic moments.
Mm-hmm. What's next?
Yeah, what's next? Well, I know the film is finished, but I hope it has a long tail life. I started speaking and doing speaking engagements about this project even before the film was ever created. So I would love to continue to do that. I still would like to do some more experimenting with local food. There's still some things I didn't get to during that year that I'd like to continue to look into. And there's thoughts, of maybe putting some kind of, I'm going to use cookbook in quotations, but
Right.
kind of like, like a how-to book, like how do you make sugar out of sugar beets, and some 100% local recipes as inspiration from where I live, interjected with some anecdotes and some beautiful photography. So there's talk of that. So I still hope to, and I hope this film can be useful for people in their own communities. I mean, obviously, our situation in Dawson is different than in Vancouver, is different than in Ontario, different than in Newfoundland.
Mm-hmm.
But there's this terroir of food, and I just think it's so important to learn what our own communities can produce and to find the community knowledge holders for our own communities, which
Right.
are so important. And to, especially during this pandemic, we have just all realized the importance of community and the importance of, being more self-sufficient as a community in times of crisis and not relying on really long supply chains. So I do hope that communities can use this film as a stepping off point for discussion and change in their own communities that's relevant to the issues in their own community around self-sufficiency and food sustainability and food security. So all that to say, there's no other film, coming very soon, because I would still like to do more with this one. And after that, yeah, we'll see. I mean, for me, it's a passion for a change that comes first, and then the filming of it comes second. So I guess we'll just see.
From your perspective, the key to a sustainable planet is knowing where your food comes from. That's seems like a vital piece of it. Is that right?
Yeah, very much so. And I think, I think when the consequence of knowing where your food comes from is valuing the people who help produce it and valuing the land that makes it. And that is a huge part of sustainability for our planet, because the more connected we are from things from the land, the more important it becomes to protect this land that we live on. And I just also feel so strongly that community is so important for so many things, and there is so much knowledge in our community, and often it's the people that aren't on the pedestal, that have this knowledge, and tapping into that is also critical for our survival, and sharing that knowledge. So yeah, all these things factor in, and they all kind of culminate in some way with food, food is cultural, food is community, sharing of food is a time when in non-COVID times we come together. And so I think food can be a real spoke in that wheel of sustainability.
So tell our listeners where they can find out more or stay in touch with you. You've got a website, I believe.
Yes, so there's a website, firstweeat.ca, and it's constantly being updated, but there's lots of resources on there, including, seeds that grow well in the north, recipes, some very humorous blog posts from my husband during the year of sort of his side of the story. There's a foraging guide on there. So it's an ever-growing resource. And also, of course, on the website is where the film is screening next, so people can keep updated, and also the ability to sign up with your location if you want to be notified when this film might be available in your community. So that's a really good place to keep track. And then the previous film, All the Time in the World, also has its own website, allthetimeintheworld.ca, and there's links there to be able to watch that film if people are curious. So
I'm curious. I haven't seen that one yet, but I want to see that too. Yeah.
Yes.
And of course, the film is screening at Vancouver International Film Festival, so www.viff.org. And it's screening until October 7th, so you've got lots of time to see it there.
As long as it lasts, I'll just say they're going really fast. So if you're interested in screening at VIFF, I would go there now and book your ticket. But the film is also planning to have a theatrical release across the country, hopefully in November.
Okay.
So if you do miss it at VIFF, it should be back through Van City in Vancouver and other places across the province and across the country in November. So there will be more chances.
Lovely. So just as we wrap up, from your heart, you've said so much. I've loved this interview, but from your heart, if you had one message that you really wish the world would get, go global, what would it be from your heart to the world?
Oh, I think value the people that surround you in your community, interact with them in real time, and really value the land that sustains us. That's the key.
Lovely. Thanks, Suzanne.
And don't forget Don't forget to check the labels when you do buy your food and find out where that food's come from and notice how far it's traveled and see if you can choose something that traveled less far.
Right. Well, it's been a pleasure. Thank you so much for joining us. And I'm sure the film's going to have fantastic reception because, as I say, it really feels so intimate and delightful, like learning, but also funny. I mean, it's amusing and funny, and it feels like you're just welcoming all of us into your family. So thanks.
Thank you. Thanks so much.
We've been speaking with Suzanne Crocker, talking about her film that's at the Vancouver International Film Festival, First We Eat. And yeah, thanks for joining us. It'll be on Wednesdays. This is our Facebook Live because the station's still on lockdown. So you can catch the show Wednesdays, 6 to 7, 100.5 FM in Vancouver, Co-op Radio on Conscious Living. I'm Tasha Simms. Bye.